Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another program as part of the weekly Thursday night programming that is put on by the Adams County Historical Society. Tonight, we have another great speaker that I'm really looking forward to y'all hearing her insight to Colonel Elmer Ellsworth. Now, for those of you that don't know, the Historical Society is located here in the heart of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and we get the pleasure of housing over 1 million artifacts from all across the county, all across the state, and some, I think, from some other places as well. And we're working on a new museum that will be able to feature a lot of these really awesome artifacts and items, some of which have never been displayed before. So it's a really exciting time. And we appreciate you tuning into our Thursday night programs. I will tell you, if you do wish to make a donation toward the Historical Society, we have a lot of questions about that on Thursday nights. There is a red button there on the bottom. I believe it's in the shape of a heart. If you want to click that, that will actually give you a chance to donate toward our project. We're, of course, trying to build a museum and trying to do these these programs here. So if you want to contribute toward that, I would not tell you you cannot. That would be much appreciated. If you do have questions, feel free to put them down here in the chat. I'm sure Meg will be glad to be answering them later on, or we'll get you some answers there on that end, because I know she's a lot smarter about that than I am. But without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Meg Groeling. And Meg, if I pronounce your name wrong, please correct me. I'm big on names. Meg is a regular contributor to the blog Emerging Civil War, exploring subjects beyond the battlefield, such as personalities, politics, and practices that affected the men who did the fighting. A writer, teacher, and curriculum developer since 1987, she has taught at both the elementary and middle school levels for more than 30 years. She graduated from California State University, Long Beach, with a BA in liberal studies, and has been involved in continuing education for her entire career. Meg received a master's degree from American Public University, majoring in military history with a Civil War emphasis. Imagine that, Meg. Savas Beatie published her first book, The Aftermath of Battle, The Burial of the Civil War Dead, in the fall of 2015. This is a volume in the Emerging Civil War series, although it differs from the others in that it takes on a much broader range of subject. The book has received excellent reviews and has already gone into its second printing. She lives in Hollister, California, in a lovely 1928 bungalow. I love this, covered with roses outside and books inside. And tonight, Meg's going to bring us some insight onto Colonel Elmer Ellsworth. So without further ado, Meg, you can take the floor here. Now's the hardest part, is getting it all pulled up, right? There you go.
All right. Hello, I'm Meg Groeling, and this is the cover of my book, First Fallen, The Life of Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, the North's first Civil War hero, published by Savas Beatie, who has graciously agreed to publish, the second book of mine. So, see if I can get things to work here. There we go. This is the man. Colonel Ellsworth was the first Union officer killed in the American Civil War, and that is about all most people know about Elmer Ellsworth. So I'm here to tell you more. This is a picture of Elmer Ellsworth in a militia uniform. It's a very early picture. He was always interested in things military ever since he was a little boy. And the problem is that unless you're in the actual military, there isn't much to do except be in the militia. And at that point in American history, the militia seriously needed an upgrade. They were pretty well known for marching in George Washington's birthday and 4th of July parades. And other than that, they'd show up for your funeral, but other than that, they were not much good as a functioning militia. So because of Ellsworth's expertise in drill and uniforming and his ability to be a man to be listened to, he ended up getting serial employment as a militia drill master in Illinois and Wisconsin. This is a picture of the Chicago Zouave Cadets. This was his first famous group. He joined them when he was living in Chicago, And he joined with his friend Arthur Devereaux, who became a colonel in the Civil War in Massachusetts. And at this point in time, it cost a lot to join a militia company. And finally, Elmer realized that in order to pay for his accoutrements and his rifle, he was going to have to volunteer to drill the militia itself. So he, of course, volunteered to do that and was fabulous at it. He won every drill competition that they entered, and they did the French-Algerian Zouave drill as well as Winfield Scott's drill, which is used by the US Army. Ellsworth issued a challenge after they'd won all the prizes they could to other militia drill teams to challenge his men, and no one responded. Oops. So this is a picture of the United States Zouave cadets, probably not a very good one. And this is what happened to the Chicago Zouave cadets. They decided to rename, reuniform the Chicago Zouave cadets, and this group became the US Zouave cadets. They planned a tour of the Northeast that took place in 20 cities, including West Point and the presidential mansion of President Buchanan. And this tour really put them on the map. They became famous all over the United States, but especially in the Northeast. This can be compared at that time to probably a rock star tour. People didn't have electronic entertainment, so they went out and saw things and did things. And to see the US Zouave cadets was a very impressive way to spend the evening. Let's see, hang on. Do I have it here? Okay, John Hay, who was soon to become one of not president at that point, one of Abraham Lincoln's secretaries, referred to Elmer Ellsworth as the most talked about man in the country. And there was rarely a newspaper that did not follow their tour from the beginning in Chicago up through the north, through upstate New York, and on to Niagara Falls, and back down through Washington, and then of course back to Chicago. This is presidential candidate Lincoln, and he lives in Springfield, and he's met Ellsworth on a couple of other occasions when one of Ellsworth's jobs was to drill the local militia, the Springfield Grays. And he had met Ellsworth and was very impressed with Ellsworth. And when the end of the 20-city tour came, Willie and Tad were so excited that Dad's friend was in town, and they were going to go see the guys drill on the field outside town. And of course, Lincoln promised them that he would take them. So Lincoln brings the kids down to the Springfield Fairgrounds to see the US Zouave cadets, meets up with Ellsworth again. And he gets Ellsworth to promise him to come back to Springfield to study law. Now, this all came about, and Elmer Ellsworth was not the only young man in this situation. Elmer Ellsworth had fallen in love and had proposed to a young lady whose father was very well-to-do. And his father said, yeah, well, that's okay, except you have to make a living. She's not going to marry any itinerant drill master. So, you best get yourself a law degree in an office. So the way lawyers were made at that point in time was they worked with a lawyer, read law with them. And when that lawyer felt they were capable, they took the bar exam in whatever state they were in, passed the bar exam. Then in Illinois, they were invited to become a lawyer. And so that was the track the trajectory of Ellsworth's life at that point in time. This is John Hay and George Nicolay, who end up on exactly the same trajectory. John Hay, of course, goes on to become Roosevelt's Secretary of State, starts the Panama Canal, an incredibly amazing man. But when he wasn't quite a man yet, he went to Brown University and he was named Poet Laureate of Brown and was absolutely certain that what he wanted to be when he grew up was a poet. He came back from Brown, an expensive Ivy League education with, you guessed it, long hair, mustache, and a hashish habit, and a binder full of poems. Well, his dad didn't take to that very kindly and explained to him that he was going to have to go down to Springfield and work with his uncle and get a law degree so he too could support himself. And George Nicolay was an aspiring journalist. He wrote for a variety of papers, all German language papers, and pro-Lincoln. And he wrote so positively about Lincoln that Lincoln had gotten in touch with him to come and, if he cared to, study law, but certainly to be Lincoln's secretary. So when Lincoln return, or when Ellsworth returns to Springfield, he also meets John Hay and George Nicolay. Hay studying law with his uncle across the hall from Abraham Lincoln. Nicolay had been publishing the German language newspaper, and all three became very good friends, almost inseparable. Nicolay was chosen to write the official Lincoln biography and become secretary, and Hay gets a job as the second secretary. Of course, the reason Lincoln even needs a secretary at this point in time is he is considering a run for the presidency in the Republican Party. And Elmer Ellsworth joins the Lincoln campaign. He ends up working with David Davis and Ward Hill Layman at the Republican convention in Chicago. Was responsible for delaying the vote for 24 hours so that that rotten New Yorker who was going to get the nomination didn't get it. They took over the wigwam. Lincoln won on the third ballot, and Elmer Ellsworth was on top of the Tremont Hotel where the Lincoln campaign headquarters in Chicago was. And they were going to fire off a cannon to celebrate Lincoln's candidacy. And, of course, Elmer Ellsworth gets his foot caught in the ropes of the cannon and almost ends his career right then and there. They were able to save it. So Lincoln is elected. Ellsworth and Hay campaigned for Lincoln, and they spoke all around the Springfield area. They were stump speakers. And they spoke up until the night before the election. Ellsworth was with Abraham Lincoln at the campaign headquarters across from the Lincoln Herndon Law Office. And he was one of the people who went with Lincoln to vote. They all vote, they come back, and they wait for the results. Finally, Pennsylvania and New York, God bless New York, come across the wires as voting for Lincoln. And then this is the point at which everybody's life changes. They go from Illinois citizens interested in things politically, dynamic, interesting men, but with no real national identity. Suddenly they are catapulted into the spotlight. And one of my favorite stories about this night is Lincoln running across the street to the wire service and checking the votes, and everybody being really nervous in the office. And finally, they find out Lincoln has won. And Mary Lincoln, of course, has designed an after party. any of us who watch television at all know what an after party is. So this one was a little different. Lincoln and his friends celebrated Lincoln's election to the presidency of the United States by going to an ice cream parlor where they could walk to it, where Mrs. Lincoln's friends had made sandwiches and cookies, as well as the gentleman who owned the ice cream parlor scooping up cones. The ice cream parlor is so quintessentially 19th century and so small town. And then their lives just change 180 degrees for all of them. And it is at this point that I really want to say that there's no picture of Lincoln that can be had without understanding his relationships with Hay, Nicolay, and certainly Elmer Ellsworth. It's not been studied enough. It's not been emphasized enough. He depended on these young men. They were surrogate sons to him. His own son was away at school. And they were part and parcel of the Lincoln household, these three young men. So Lincoln is elected president, but of course he's not going to Washington immediately. And during the time between when Lincoln won and the time between he had to leave to go to Washington, Ellsworth is busy. He is busy presenting a plan to the Illinois legislature for the reorganization of the state militia. And this would put the state, and he hoped other states, on a firmer wartime footing, because after his 20-city tour, he realized that the United States really needed to step up their game in order to get the militia groups into the army as quickly and efficiently as possible. And he presented this act for the reorganization of the militia of Illinois all the way up to the final vote. And then he simply ran out of time. He had to go to Washington with Lincoln. If you read this, you really realize that this is a blueprint for a National Guard or state, well, we don't call them state militias anymore, a National Guard. And it's really could have been used nationally. Also, he took his bar exam, and on February 14th, passed the bar exam. What a nice Valentine. And for a long time, it was not known whether or not he passed the bar exam. And it would say in all the books, well, some of the books, well, we don't know if he really passed the bar exam or not. He was so busy. We don't know what kind of education he truly got. Well, then in 2017, the Springfield the folks at the State House found a cupboard and opened the cupboard, and there were decaying cardboard boxes in there. And inside the decaying cardboard boxes were old, mildewed papers that contained the letters that had been signed by every man, and later on, of course, women, who had become a lawyer in the state of Illinois. And Barack Obama's letter was there, Mrs. Obama's letter was there, and sure enough, Elmer Ellsworth's letter was there. So that's no longer a question. He definitely did have his law degree. This is a reproduction of the Inaugural Express in 1861, and they chose to ride a steam engine from Illinois through the small towns into Washington. And the steam engine competition was intense. They changed steam engines at every town. Every town tried to outdo each other. These were marvels of steam and gleam, and just, you know, the most beautiful steam engines that the northern part of the United States could possibly produce. And they all tried to outdo each other. And It began on a rainy morning in Springfield. This is Ward Hill Layman inside the door, and standing next to a drawing of Lincoln is Elmer Ellsworth. And Elmer wasn't sure he was going, but Lincoln finally asked him to go and said he would be in charge of the presidential party all the time it was not on the train. The problem with this, I mean, everything sounded great until he started going. Within hours of the time Lincoln left Springfield, folks in Washington were aware of what is now called the Baltimore plot. There is no doubt that the plan to assassinate Lincoln was real. Practically, as far as I know, everything now from the Freedom of Information Act has been released, including Pinkerton's personal notes and Winfield Scott's notes. And this was definitely a plan to assassinate the president. The last pieces of the puzzle for this plot were put together only a few years ago when all these notes were collected together. So when Lincoln decided to leave the train and travel to Washington with Pinkerton Detective Kate Warrens and Ward Hill Layman so that he wouldn't get assassinated, Elmer Ellsworth was tasked with guarding the things most precious to Abraham Lincoln. It's Mrs. Lincoln and his sons, as they continued to move along the original route through Baltimore and onto the Capitol. I personally think this would make a remake of a movie. It has a grand plot, wonderful characters, beautiful steam trains. Elmer Ellsworth, Ward Hill Layman, who could ask for more? And this is Major General Winfield Scott and Colonel Charles Stone. Stone might be familiar to you in another context. He was the one that was blamed for the debacle at Ball's Bluff, but he had not had that happen to him yet, and he was put in charge of helping Winfield Scott. He's put in charge by Winfield Scott of taking care of reconnoitering Washington when the president-elect arrived. The reason this is important is that Lincoln had promised Ellsworth a job as a major of militias as soon as they got to Washington. Both Lincoln and Ellsworth were ignorant of how exactly the Army appointed men to be officers, especially men who'd never been in the Army. Major General Winfield Scott was already aware of the assassination attempt early on, and he was determined to get Lincoln safely inaugurated. He appointed Colonel Charles Stone to be in charge of coordinating the local militias in Washington and the U.S. Army to make the Capitol safe until Lincoln was inaugurated. I'm sure you've read about the inauguration of 1861, where there were snipers on every rooftop and all of that. So the city was pretty much buttoned down. This was going to be a safe inauguration. Both Scott and Stone did an excellent job at this, and there was really no need for Ellsworth to be a major of militias at this point. Ellsworth graciously backed down as soon as he understood the situation, and he never wanted to cause any issue for Lincoln. This is Tad Lincoln in his Zouave uniform, and in Washington, Ellsworth was a beloved member of Lincoln's extended family. He had been in Springfield. He and Willie, Tad and Willie loved Ellsworth like an older brother. Ellsworth came to play with them at the house and also at the presidential mansion. And they were all in Willard's Hotel at the time, and he came up and played with the boys. And whenever Mrs. Lincoln would get a little fussy, you could depend on Elmer Ellsworth to smile and laugh and take her arm and flirt with her and get her calmed down so that she could do whatever it was they needed for her to do. This is a Willard Hotel, which was lately in the news, actually. Elmer Ellsworth lived here when he came to Washington. This is how it works. The president doesn't leave the presidential mansion until the day of the inauguration. So you have to put the president-elect and his family and group somewhere, and they were put at the Willard. And so everyone's living at the Willard and waiting for the mansion to be vacated. This was the problem. One evening, Elmer felt ill and feverish. He went to bed because he was still living at the Willard, and woke up with spots all over his face. His younger brother had died within the last year of what might have been smallpox. It's probably typhoid. And Elmer Ellsworth panicked. He thought he had smallpox. Oh my God. He was scared beyond belief, and he acted like the diva he sometimes was. And he went to what he was sure was his deathbed and did not get up. Several days later, Hay and Nicolay, who were living at the presidential mansion, came pounding on the door at Willard's. They hadn't seen Ellsworth for a couple of days. That was unusual. He was around all the time. And they were very concerned about him. Ellsworth peeked around the corner of the door, thinking that at least he would be able to say his final goodbyes to Hay and Nicolay, give his best to the president. It was at that point that Hay informed him that the Lincoln boys had come down a few days earlier with the measles, and that probably Ellsworth had caught the measles from the boys, and it was not smallpox. Well, back then, when they didn't have vaccines, the measles was still a very problematic illness, especially for a young man. And Ellsworth was, whether it was smallpox or not, he was still very ill. And one afternoon, when Hay was visiting the patient, he and Ellsworth spoke of the current political situation. Hay told Ellsworth it was dire. He then recorded Ellsworth's reaction as follows. I can only speak for myself. You know, I have a great work to do, to which my life is pledged, and yet I could ask no better death than to fall next week before Sumter. You will find that patriotism is not dead, even if it sleeps. Sumter falls. Lincoln calls for 75,000 men, and Elmer Ellsworth drags himself from his bed to go see Lincoln. Ellsworth explains that he wants to go to New York City and recruit a regiment from the ranks of the New York City firefighters. They alone can do what he needs them to do, which is fight alone and as a team. And they're already trained. Lincoln writes him a letter of introduction to Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune. And Colonel Ellsworth tells everyone, I want the New York firemen. There are no more effective men in the country, and none with whom I can do so much. They're sleeping on a volcano at Washington, and I want men who can go into a fight now. Ellsworth tells that to Greeley, and Greeley does all he can to help Ellsworth recruit his men. And Ellsworth was amazingly successful. In less than 2 days, over 1,200 men were recruited to fight in what became the 11th New York Volunteer Infantry, or the firefighters regiment. And it was so he was so successful that he officered his regiment. Well, I'll explain that in a minute. He was amazingly successful, and like I say, in 2 days, over 1,200 firefighters. So, and one of the things Elmer Ellsworth had learned to do early on, when he was officering a regiment or a militia, was to pick men who were already known to the rank and file. So a lot of Elmer Ellsworth's lower ranking officers are former U.S. Zouave cadets, because they're familiar with the Zouave drill and with the way Elmer likes things done. But he also picked Lieutenant Colonel Noah Farnham, and Farnham was the head of one of the fire departments in New York. Same thing for Major Krieger, who's also one of the heads of the fire department in New York. So they were being officered by men already known to them. The mayor of New York, however, was concerned because the number of volunteers looked like it was going to decimate the New York Fire Department. He limited Ellsworth to 1 regiment. Now, I've included this dual picture of flags. They were, of course, given flags by every luminary in New York on their way to the Baltic to take off for Washington. And the flag on the left is the original flag of the 11th New York Fire Zouaves. It's beautifully done, hand embroidered, made out of silk. But the one on the right is also beautifully embroidered, made out of silk and fabulous. And there's a group of men that I am particularly fond of. They're reenactors, and they portray the 11th New York Fire Zouaves. And several of them got together and decided they were going to reproduce this incredible flag. And as you can see, the fire hoses and helmets and the ladders and the hooks and everything. This is just an incredibly beautiful flag. And I think an incredibly heartfelt tribute to the Fire Zouaves. Right. The 11th New York leaves New York on the Baltic. The Baltic should sound familiar. It was one of the, pardon me, one of the ships that tried to bring supplies to Fort Sumter, and was used through at least 3/4 of the war before it was sunk. The regiment was now designated the 11th New York Volunteer Infantry. They marched through New York down to the wharf and took the Baltic to Annapolis. When they arrived in Washington, because of Ellsworth's former fame, they were anticipated and written about. It says, among the many and varied uniformed troops arriving in the capital this week was the much publicized and gaudy regiment of the New York Fire Zouaves. This unit, under the command of dashing young Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, is attired in a uniform of sky blue trousers, bloused over white leggings, short red jackets topped by an Egyptian fez, complete with tassel for headgear. The regiment is one of the best drilled outfits in the city today and is equipped with the new 58 caliber Sharps rifles. The reason I included this is that maybe some of you have heard about the scandal in New York over shoddy material. And what shoddy are the sweepings from underneath sewing machines of, bits and pieces of fabric and thread, and they're all wet down and felted together. And then this is alleged to be actual woven fabric, and they were, to cut costs, using this to make Union uniforms, because they needed them immediately, of course. And Elmer Ellsworth's men were attired in that uniform, but not for very long. They fell apart pretty quickly. The same thing was true for the 58 caliber Sharps rifles, more or less. They had been promised the Sharps, and the Army was kind of slow about getting the Sharps to them. But every time Ellsworth addressed his men, he would give them a new update as to just how many rifles had come in and how he was working as hard as he could to get their uniforms replaced and to get the rifles they had been promised. When the When the 11th New York arrived at the Capitol, they were placed in the Senate chambers because no camps had been set up, not just for the fire zouaves, for anybody. So the entire city of Washington was swarming with volunteer Union troops who had no real place to stay and nothing to do. In the Senate chambers, the fire zouaves climbed to the top of the rotunda and held mock sessions of Congress, drank too much, caroused, generally made a nuisance of themselves. Of course, all the units arriving in Washington did the same thing, but Elmer was mortified. He paid their fines, sent a couple of men back to New York, and generally tried to quiet the rumors and quell the bad publicity. Then, luckily, a fire broke out next to Willard's Hotel, and the New York firefighters were ready to help, all to the delight of the press and the onlookers. It's easy to find this particular image online, and I would suggest that you do so because you can see the things that firefighters do that zouaves also do. Yeah, there are human ladders. There's a gentleman, get this in here, a gentleman hanging by his legs upside down to so that his hose can reach the fire. There's a human ladder here. There's one here, and there's another one here. And they are using every tool at their command to fight this fire. The firemen who were more involved in the pumping aspect of fighting the fire were also helping the people who were evacuating Willard's. And so here were these huge, gruff New York firefighters turned zouave cadets, or zouave army guys with Irish brogues, and they were not the mean, horrible drunkards that everyone had thought they were. They very kindly helped people with their luggage and, picked up kids and got them to their parents and did all that kind of stuff. So they were actually pretty well thought of by the time this finished. They saved the day, and at this point, the camps outside Washington were almost ready enough anyway. So all of the problems were solved. Both the 11th New York and their colonel were back in everybody's good graces again. Now, this is a picture of the Long Bridge, May 23rd, 24th, in 1861. The fire was just a couple of days before this. Excuse me. Thank you. As you can see, it's night. The moon is full. And they're on the way to Alexandria. This is what you need to know about that night. There's a lot to know about that night, but prior to that time, Virginia had voted to secede, but until it was ratified, they could not do so. And the evening of the election, or the day of the election, May 23rd, the citizens of Virginia voted to ratify secession so that Virginia could leave the Union. Lincoln, of course, knew this and had told the city fathers in Alexandria, as well as the Confederate Army, that Alexandria was just too close. It's literally across the Potomac to the capital, Washington, and that they were going to take Alexandria that night, put it under martial law. There would be no shots fired. There would be no fighting. Nothing was going to go on except that Alexandria was going to be under martial law. They were going to build hospitals there or convert buildings to hospitals there that would be used both for Northern and Southern soldiers. And Alexandria would be safe. Those of you who saw the series Mercy Street, that those hospitals were in Alexandria, supposedly. But martial law means that no matter what the citizens of the city want to do, the needs of the military come first. We just had a confusion about martial law in the news lately. It's spelled Martial, and what it means is that the army is in control. This was explained to Alexandria. They agreed to it. They agreed to evacuate the Confederate Army, the couple of companies that were there. So about 2:30 in the morning on the 24th, the Army of the Potomac, which it wasn't called that then, crossed the Potomac and in a variety of ways, and went into Alexandria. The cavalry and the artillery used the bridges to cross the Potomac, and the Zouaves crossed on paddle wheel steamers. And the 11th New York, Ellsworth's unit, had been given the privilege of being in the van. They were the first to disembark at the wharf. Which brings us to James W. Jackson. This handsome young man is the proprietor of the Marshall House Hotel in Alexandria, Virginia. He's young, sort of a hotspur. He's married, he has a couple of little girls, and the Marshall House Hotel is a family hotel and boarding house in Alexandria. It's not just an overnight hotel. In the book, there is a whole chapter on Jackson. He had quite a reputation as a secessionist. He was sort of a hotspur, and absolutely believed in his cause. He had been celebrating the night of the 23rd, but had gotten home to make sure his hotel was okay and had gone to bed. This is the Marshall House, and as you can see, it's at the corner of Pitt and King Street. And on top of the Marshall House is a flag. And this flag was so large that it could be seen from Lincoln's office if he used a telescope. It was made out of sailcloth, which is a very heavy fabric. It was made by a lady named Mrs. Paget, who she and her husband, a sailmaker, lived at the Marshall House Hotel. 18 feet by 24 feet. It's currently what's left of it in the New York State Military Museum. And contrary to many apocryphal stories, it could never have been folded up by Mrs. Lincoln and put into a bureau drawer, or removed from that drawer and dragged through cabinet meetings by Tad. It's too big and it's too heavy. So Ellsworth leaves the wharf to march to downtown Alexandria. He has soldiers and journalists with him. He is ordered to cut the Western Union line, so there's no communication between the Confederate Army and Alexandria. They march past the hotel. He looks up, sees the flag, and decides to send all but 7 men to the telegraph office, and he enters the Marshall House with his remaining men. This is the flag in question. This is a picture of it. The idea was that each one of these stars in the canton would be states that it's seceded, but the middle was left open so that the star representing Virginia could go right in the middle. This is the flag as it is now at the Military Museum in New York, and it has been beautifully taken care of. And as you can see, it is really large. You might wonder about the 90-degree angles here. People laugh, oh, square bullets. No, it has been souvenired. That means pieces were cut out of it so that they could be sold, and people could make some money off of it. Hold on here, I've screwed up. Okay. Right, so this is the cover of my book, and the way this painting His design is interesting, I think, with the two rifles in the center, crossing in the center of the painting. It's that they make a cross. The only two faces copied from life are Colonel Ellsworth and Francis Brownell, the gentleman in front holding the rifle. The others are in shadow, or like Jackson, turned away from the viewer. The light's carefully controlled. It guides your eye into and through the painting and lets the story itself emerge. Alonzo Chappell was a very well-known military painter in the 1800s. So what shows in this, I'll go back to it, I think. They go to the Marshall House Hotel, they knock on the door, 7 of them, and are told that, no, the proprietor's not here. They don't know what, it's the middle of the night, it's 2:30 in the morning, and they don't know what's going on. So Ellsworth details Zouave to stand on the landing at the first floor, goes up to the second floor, nothing's there, details another Zouave to stand on the second floor, and goes up to the third floor and into a trap door, which gets him to the top of the Marshall House, where the Bowie knives, which were part and parcel of Zouave's accoutrements, were used to cut the halyards of the flag. The flag fell, and they started back down. Elmer was holding the flag, trailing it behind him, trying to loop it over his arms. It was so big. As they come down the stairs to the landing, a man in pants and his shirt was his night shirt meets them at the bottom. He takes one look at them and says, "You're going to die." And he has a double-barreled shotgun. He shoots Elmer Ellsworth with one barrel. Immediately, Francis Brownell, the gentleman in front, Private Brownell, uses his bayonet to push the shotgun aside. When the second shot is fired, it goes into the door frame. And then Brownell turns his rifle, shoots Jackson, and stabs him with the bayonet just to make sure the work is done. This all happens in a matter of seconds. And in those seconds, the floor is covered with blood, and both Ellsworth and Jackson are dead. The headlines were of the worst kind. Again and again, the Marshall House Hotel is shown. A scene is reenacted. The world is stunned. Of course, it's kept quiet at first. The Zouaves managed to get the Ellsworth's body over to the wharf and then wrapped in the flag, and then across the Potomac to the Naval Yard. Mrs. Lincoln finds out. She's the first to arrive. She brings flowers with her, and the Lincolns are devastated. And then the headlines begin. Private Francis Brownell now becomes known as the man who killed Ellsworth. They are forever linked. Ellsworth is embalmed and then lies in the East Room of the Executive Mansion. The Zouaves, including Brownell, accompany Ellsworth's casket, and they bring the flag with them. You can see it on top of the casket there. The American flag is also there. Then his body is, after the service, is taken to Union Station to go by train to New York City, where he is met by his parents, Ellsworth's parents. He lies in state at the Astor House and City Hall and is taken by steamboat up the Hudson. The fallout is tremendous. I included also an envelope from the South, the housebreaker and thief, but that can't happen because martial law, but all over the place. Ellsworth's picture and drawings of his death and pictures of his Zouave cadets were on every envelope and every sheet of paper, every postcard, and people are all urged to remember Ellsworth. The funeral dirges came by the hundreds. They were mostly published in Chicago, and they have said that more music was written in Chicago for Ellsworth than for any other individual in the Civil War, including Lincoln. This is just an example of a couple of them. The Marshall House itself has undergone reconstruction a couple of times. It's now called the Alexandria. It's a lovely hotel, and it's still very much a historic hotel. In the 1930s, the Daughters of Confederate Veterans placed a plaque there, and the plaque was to James W. Jackson, who was killed by federal soldiers while defending his property and personal rights, as stated in the verdict of the coroner's jury. He was the first martyr to the cause of Southern independence. The justice of history does not permit his name to be forgotten. Nowhere on this plaque set by the Daughters of the Confederacy is the name Elmer Ellsworth at all. Several years ago, that was taken down and returned to the Daughters of the Confederacy. And now there is an explanatory kiosk placed by the city of Alexandria that gives a much more nuanced and balanced explanation of just what went on at the Marshall House. This is a question I've gotten from many people, so I thought add it into the slideshow. This is some memento mori. There's a plaque with laurel leaves, a cockade. This is Ellsworth's dress uniform jacket, the one he was wearing the night he was killed. And if you note the hole, it's obviously right over the heart. And if you also look, you don't even have to look closely, there's a definite absence of blood. And it's because one of the curators of the New York Military Museum decided there was just far too much blood. It was too icky. And she took it upon herself, I believe in the 1980s, to have the uniform cleaned. So those of you who are going into museum studies, don't do that. This, when you do research, you see a lot of things, you read a lot of things, you touch a lot of things. And one of the things that really got me teared up was Ellsworth's red kepi. It's at Fort Ward in Alexandria. They have a lovely Ellsworth exhibit, Ellsworth and Jackson exhibit. And I had seen this kepi so many times in so many paintings and drawings and everything. And when I saw it in person, it was just like, oh my goodness, this is real. So I haven't yet found anybody to reproduce this kepi for me, but this certainly brought more than one tear to my eye. John Hay, who was a fabulous writer, was asked to write an obituary, and this is part of the obituary he wrote for the New York papers. To his friends, he always seemed like a paladin or cavalier of the dead days of romance and beauty. Elmer Ellsworth wrote a letter to his parents. The letters were found in his front pocket. And he said to his parents, Ellsworth had a premonition, actually, that he would not be coming back from the Marshall House Hotel or from Alexandria. And To his parents, he said, "He who noteth even the fall of a sparrow will have some purpose, even in the fate of one like me." Another really famous letter concerning Ellsworth is from Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was known for writing beautiful, because we call them dead soldier letters, letters of condolence. They were written by friends, they were written by commanders, they were written by everybody you could think of, to the families of soldiers who had lost their lives in battle. But the first one that went out was to the mother and father of Colonel Elmer Ellsworth. This is in the Huntington Library, and it is probably the most beautiful letter that Lincoln ever wrote. There are several that are, that challenge that, but it turns out that the circumstances of those letters were not always as they should have been. "My dear sir and madam, in the untimely loss of your noble son, our affliction here is scarcely less than your own. So much of promised usefulness to one's country and of bright hopes for one's self and friends have rarely been so suddenly dashed as in his fall. In size, in years, and in youthful appearance a boy only, his power to command men was surprisingly great. This power, combined with a fine intellect, and indomitable energy, and a taste altogether military, constituted in him, as seemed to me, the best natural talent in that department I ever knew. And yet he was singularly modest and deferential in social intercourse. My acquaintance with him began less than 2 years ago. Through the latter half of the intervening period, it was as intimate as the disparity in our ages and my engrossing engagements would permit. To me, he appeared to have no indulgences or pastimes, and I never heard him utter a profane or intemperate word. What was conclusive of his good heart, he never forgot his parents. The honors he labored for so laudably, and in the sad end so gallantly gave his life, he meant for them no less than for himself. In the hope that it may be no intrusion upon the sacredness of your sorrow, I have ventured to address you this tribute to the memory of my young friend and your brave and early fallen child. May God give you that consolation which is beyond all earthly power. Sincerely, your friend in a common affliction, Abraham Lincoln. At the various centennial celebrations for Ellsworth, his grave has been decorated many times. This is a couple of examples. I believe there's 125th there and the 150th. When I was there, none of this was left. Of course, I left one, but this one was the day I was there. The name of the cemetery where he's buried is the Hudson View Cemetery. And they have a family plot. There's and Ellsworth's obelisk is the largest in the family plot. It was a fall day, very quiet in the cemetery. Because so many leaves were gone from the trees, I could hear the Hudson. It really is a Hudson view. And the cicadas were singing Ellsworth's Requiem, in my opinion. It was a very moving time. I think we all probably visit a lot of grave sites, but Ellsworth is one of the most beautiful I've ever visited. And certainly one of the most moving. So here it is in other days. And this is my book, First Fallen. There's a lot more to it. Like I said before, the emphasis is on what Ellsworth actually had to give to America, and his friendship with Lincoln and Hay and Nicolay, and how much it meant to the family in the White House. And I hope that you buy it. I hope that you enjoy it. And thank you very much.
Meg, that was wonderful. I definitely learned a lot about Ellsworth, and I find him fascinating because we always talk about one piece of his story, but as to so many characters in history, there's so much to talk about, and there's so much interesting things. I had no idea he was connected to Lincoln, so that is so fascinating. No one ever talks about that.
And to me, especially if you are not into Ellsworth, but into Lincoln,
Mhm.
you need to know about Hay and Nicolay and Ellsworth. I mean, it wasn't a substitute for Robert Lincoln in any way. None of them were, but they were his inspiration. They were his backbone. They were the men who he went to first. He went to John Hay and said, know that his son Willie had died. It was John Hay that heard that first. Hay goes on to an incredible military career that we don't know nearly enough about. His beautifully written words are all over Lincoln's own papers. Just the way all three of those young men were enfolded into the Lincoln family, I think, is something that we don't pay anywhere near enough attention to. Lincoln is always sort of not always, sort of a wooden figure.
Mhm.
And these knowing about these relationships really soften him up, flesh him out.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely enjoyed that, and I appreciate your insight. Thank you so much for putting that together for us. Yeah, for those of you that might like to get a copy of Meg's book, I believe we're going to be putting a copy of the link to purchase somewhere in one of these posts that we have associated with this night. So yeah, get the book, learn some more. Thank you to those that donated tonight, by the way, to our Historical Society Fund. You're going to help us to really help build the museum, work on these programs. We do a new program every Thursday night. So yeah, make sure to not only support us, but support Meg with her endeavor as well. But I hope that we will see you all next Thursday night for another part of our weekly program series. We have another awesome speaker for you next week, but I won't spoil it for you yet. You got to wait till next week to find out. So Meg, I want to thank you so much for joining us. Any last thoughts?
Pleasure. Pardon?
Any last thoughts?
No, just that the book's gotten really good reviews from really important people. And the things that I wanted to say are being heard by the men and women who are reading it, that he really was not just flash in the pan showman who wasn't a real soldier, wasn't anything like that at all. He was a very important part of understanding the early part of the war. And the early part of the war itself is completely different than anything after Antietam, certainly. It gets pretty serious. Not the Bull Run wasn't serious, but it gets pretty serious after that. But Elmer Ellsworth is part of what makes us able to go to war, able to prosecute a war. When we see what's happening in Ukraine and we see the pictures of the little grandmas holding their kittens and getting on trains, and the wives crying for their husbands and all that. I was so, each one of those images reminds me of what it takes to bring people to the point where they can make the other guy die for his country. And I think that understanding Elmer Ellsworth brings us much closer to understanding just, there are things worse than war, and people need to fight for them. And how do you get them to do that? Well, this is how.
Yeah. That's wonderful. Well, Meg, thank you so much for joining us. And we'll see everybody on here next week for another program.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.